Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
This past week, unspecified interpretive materials related to slavery were either removed or tagged for removal from Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia. It also was reported that a troubling photo known as the Scourged Back that depicted the scar-riddled back of an enslaved man was taken down from Fort Pulaski National Monument in Georgia. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. The national park system has been pulled into the current-day battles of wokeism of sorts through the removal of those, and likely other, interpretive materials in the parks that help us better understand enslaved history. Where it will end, or whether it will be reversed, is unknown. To better understand what's transpiring and what the impacts are, we've invited Alan Spears, the Senior Director for Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association, to join us today. I'll be back in a minute with Alan.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for joining me.
Kurt, it's good to see you. It's good to be with you again. Thank you.
You know, I wish we were talking about happier things involving the National Park System, the National Park Service, but it looks like we're heading down some dark times with what the administration wants to do or is trying to do with the national parks in terms of whitewashing, censoring, disappearing history, whatever you want to call it. I mean, what's your take on that? Is that an overreaction?
No, I think this is about as serious as it gets. We've got bad budgets being proposed, staffing reductions, and now the history erasure thing. And we are, I think, every generation thinks that they're at a crossroads. I really do believe that we are fundamentally at a crossroads right now about what historic interpretation in this country, and in particular within the National Park Service, is going to look like. And we have the fight of our lives on our hands right now to make sure that we are going to enable the agency to continue to tell history in ways that are accurate, just, inclusive, and inspiring.
You know, the big news this past week was the removal of some objects at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia, and I believe Fort Pulaski. Are those the only two sites that you're aware of where some pieces were taken away?
Well, you know, this is not a transparent process. It's being run by this administration or by the Secretary of the Interior. So we are in the process of sort of catching up as we go. There is the Scourged Back photograph that was removed from Fort Pulaski, or will be soon removed from Fort Pulaski. And we're hearing in ways that we can believe that the John Brown Museum at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park is having some of the installations within that museum reviewed and flagged as being no longer appropriate because they appear to talk about slavery in ways that denigrate Americans. And according to the letters of noncompliance that have gone out to the National Park Service and park managers and superintendents, there are some things undetermined at this point in time within that museum that are going to have to go and be placed in a basement tucked behind somebody's desk until times change or until the policy is reversed.
And
And
certainly,
I was just going to say, in addition to that, I mean, there are, again, I'll go back to the fact that this has not been a very transparent process. We know that not all national parks received letters of noncompliance, but almost everybody submitted lists in response to the Secretarial Order 3431 that came out on May 20th of this year, asking people to flag things that might run afoul of the Secretarial Order on restoring truth and sanity to American history. So everything is in play. It seems like the focus at this point in time is on slavery, and especially on removing or sanitizing interpretation at sites that might play a leading role in the 250th anniversary of American independence, because that's a celebration that's coming up pretty quick. And it
yeah.
looks like maybe the administration wants to clear stuff out of there so people don't have to think critically about any of the issues that were facing us at the founding of the country.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's not restricted to just those two parks that we're aware of. I mean, you've got Cane Creole, you've got Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania. There were some slave revolts at Chatham House. You've got Arlington House, and you just go on and on and on. And, it could keep the Park Service busy for the rest of this year, taking things down and putting them into storage.
Well, on that particular point, I think it's important to understand, at least as far as NPCA is aware, the National Park Service is not getting a lot of detailed instruction about how to remove these things or take them down. And they're also not getting any additional funding. So we've already got some challenging budgets for national parks and a lessening of the number of people who are working there. And now this comes in and completely further disrupts the work plans and the things that the National Park Service staff are doing on a regular basis with not enough money and not enough people. And so this becomes an extra unnecessary punitive burden.
Sure, sure. But the bigger question here, why is it being done, and what is the effect? What is the effect of removing history from the national parks? I mean, the National Park Service has been called America's storyteller. These are stories that they can't tell.
Well, I've actually used that phrase, that the national parks are America's storyteller. And, we'll take a breath pause. You've got a very well-informed audience, but maybe just take a moment to say there are 433 units in the current national park system. Everything from Yosemite and Yellowstone to the Frederick Douglass home here in my hometown of Washington, D.C., they all bear the responsibility for interpreting, preserving, and managing historic and cultural resources. That's why the Park Service is the nation's storyteller. Then you can move into the outward-facing programs that the National Park Service manages: National Register of Historic Places, National Historic Landmarks Program, National Heritage Areas, Japanese American concentration sites. And so the Park Service has really been about the work since its inception, but certainly over the last 20 to 30 years, of helping to democratize the process of preservation in this country. So that's why when we see efforts to remove or sanitize history in our national parks, that's why it's such a great concern. And I think one of the things that's challenging for all of us right now is, because the Park Service plays this mighty role in protecting historic and cultural resources and interpreting them, parks are a great natural place to go to learn about this country's history, to learn about civics, to learn about stewardship, and to be able to see how the history of other people, the cultures of other people, have fit into this shared national narrative that we've developed over the last 250 years. When we get to a point where we are excising bits and pieces of that, we are becoming less well informed about each other, less likely that we can kind of have a good interrelationship with each other. And I think this is an effort that ultimately makes us dumber, not smarter.
Is it something that extends to interpretive programs presented by rangers? I mean, are they going to be told you can no longer talk about this, you can no longer talk about that? We want to see what you're going to talk about so we can go through and let you know if it's okay to talk about.
That's a good question. And I'm not sure if people are being told not to incorporate, say, something about slavery or LGBTQ rights and history, women's suffrage, labor history into their interpretive talks. One, there's just less people to do those interpretive talks. That's bad enough. But I think the secretarial order and this notion that the administration, which is pretty quick to let people go, to fire people, to buy people out, is going to have a chilling effect on any interpretive ranger. Because in addition to all the stuff that's going on outside, remember, we now have these QR codes in all national parks. And so I can go in there, you can go in there, we can scan those QR codes, and then we can bring up a site and we can say what we want are better budgets for the National Park Service, more staff for the National Park Service. We want them to do deeper dives on historic and cultural resources. We want more information about tribes. We want more information about people of color. We want more information about women. But if you are an interpretive ranger and you're leading people on a tour of Antietam or Gettysburg and the hallowed ground at those battlefields, and you know that enslaved people and free African Americans played a role in the history of the Civil War, that slavery was a root cause of the conflict, do you say that out loud? Out of fear, or from fear that somebody might then go scan their QR codes and say, Ranger Allen, Ranger Kurt said this, and it offended my entire family. So I don't think that on the front end, we've got people who are sort of going around and engaging or taking interpretive tours and then telling on people. But there is certainly the fear that on the back end, you could offend someone and then they take their case straight to the Interior Department. And the next thing you know, you've got an email or a phone call and you could be in a lot of trouble. That's not the kind of environment we want to provide for National Park Service historians or interpretive rangers or museum collection specialists or ethnographers or any of the staff at our parks.
Well, and I guess the question that goes begging is, does the administration care about those positions? Or do they just want people to keep the restrooms clean, to hand out park brochures, and to point you to where you can see lions and tigers and bears?
Yeah, it's so you're talking about the thing that has plagued me as a lover of history and a history person by profession and by training and by passion. Certainly, when parks are open, the idea is you've got to have the parking, you've got to have the restrooms open. You know, that I'm going to corrupt the old phrase because I don't want to say it on your podcast, but first people find the restroom, then they buy a postcard, then maybe they go out and see what's on the fields or in other places. And so I think what's happening with this administration is, and the policies that we're seeing emanating from this administration and from the current Secretary of the Interior, demonstrate a pronounced lack of appreciation for what it takes to protect, preserve, and interpret our national heritage. I have said in the past that those cannons that are on the battlefield at Gettysburg, it's not like elves come out after the sun goes down and they take care of them, they clean them, and they restore them. You've got to have a dedicated staff who can do that. And it's not just cannon preservation, but placing them at a site on the battlefield that can help tell the story accurately. So I don't think that there is a good appreciation or understanding of the nuanced role and the multiple roles that it takes for the National Park Service to protect and preserve these historic and cultural resources, not coming from this administration, no. I also think that extends to the way that they are rolling out their letters of noncompliance and trying to erase things. It's just sort of, the National Park Service, before they put up an interpretive sign, they are going to have a number of conversations. They're going to do a great deal of research. It's going to take weeks, it's going to take months, it's going to take years. And they are consulting with scholars inside the agency, experts outside the agency, people in communities who might have a tie to the story that's being told and represented and preserved. This administration has rolled out a sanitization campaign and implemented it in 2 months without having conversations with subject matter experts. I don't know who's in this sort of star chamber of people who are picking and choosing what gets removed. I don't know who decided that the Scourged Back photograph had to come down from Fort Pulaski, but I'm going to make an assumption here that I think is correct, probably. We're not talking about Pulitzer Prize winning historians who are being involved in these decision-making processes. And that further complicates things. That just makes it, again, punitive, unnecessary, and wrong-headed, in my opinion.
You mentioned the 250th anniversary of the country coming up next year. How do you interpret that? Because certainly they were enslaved on both sides of the battles. Do you pick and choose which stories you're going to tell?
I think it's entirely possible if you're an interpretive ranger and maybe you've got 45 minutes to 90 minutes with a group, you can't do everything. And not everybody's going to see everything when they go to a park, even if all the resources are laid out for them. But I think what you do is you don't limit the ability of people to talk about these things. So let's go to Independence Hall and President's House. In 1790, when George Washington brought his family up from Mount Vernon, he also brought up 8 enslaved people. There was a ninth that was added later on, so 9 enslaved people altogether. And while George Washington was doing his thing as the first president of the country, and he deserves great credit for that, great credit for leading the Continental Army through all those years of turmoil and bloodshed, and that led to final victory at Yorktown. He is a founding father. He deserves all the credit in the world for that. More to the point, maybe, after his second term concluded, there were people who were whispering in George Washington's ear, General Washington, we know some people with muskets. You want to stick around, you can stick around. And he had the fortitude to say, the character to say, no, what we do in this country is we support civilian government, right? So there are going to be elections after I go, and we're going to support that process. We have a democracy today because of the actions that he took, or maybe the actions that he didn't take back in the 1790s. He deserves credit for that. But regarding those 9 enslaved people that were with him, he put in a lot of time thinking about their fate and their lives. And one of the ways that we know that is because at that time in the 1790s, Pennsylvania was becoming a free state that was in the process of abolishing slavery and the slave trade. And so Washington understood that if his enslaved people stayed in Philadelphia for more than 6 months, they might be able to make a case that they were eligible for manumission because they had lived for such a long time in a free state. That's why he shuttled them back and forth between Philadelphia and Mount Vernon. So that has to be a part of the story. If the enslaved people had never come up, if they came up once and, worked at a dinner party for George Washington and then went back to Mount Vernon, I think there would be a case to be made that we don't need to interpret slavery at the president's house at Independence Hall. But this was a large part of Washington's time. He spent a lot of energy thinking about how these people were going to be used and how to maintain them as enslaved people. And we know that at least 2 of them, including a woman by the name of Oni or Ona Judge, made their escape into Pennsylvania's free community and then further north. So that there was a clear sense that the people who were enslaved for George Washington did not like the fact that they were owned by somebody else and took their own liberty. I think that's a fascinating part of our history. I'd like to see that. And I think we are able to do that. And certainly the Park Service is able to do that without vilifying George Washington.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. At Independence Hall there in Philadelphia, they've got quite a few placards about slavery, enslaved peoples, George Washington and his enslaved. Are those placards and plaques going to come down and disappear?
Well, that is the plan that we're hearing about right now. And for folks that might be paying attention to what's going on in Philadelphia, there was an archaeological dig, I think, in 2000, and it uncovered the remnants of the president's house. Remember, Washington, D.C. isn't on the map, isn't on the landscape until 1800. So for both terms of Washington's presidency, he was residing in Philadelphia or in Mount Vernon. And when they rediscovered the remnants of this house, they also discovered the remnants of the enslaved quarters, where the people who were there to serve George Washington and Martha Washington were residing. And so the Park Service was not necessarily a fan of the idea of interpreting slavery at this particular site, but there was a great deal of pressure from the community. I think a great deal of pressure from scholars and historians inside the agency, and ultimately they decided to create an installation about slavery at the president's house. And those placards that you're talking about, Kurt, those are actually on display. And this is very close to Independence Hall, very close to Independence Hall, very close to the Liberty Bell. And it looks like right now that has been flagged for removal. I have read in the press that the city of Philadelphia or private interests are interested maybe in relocating that just across the street onto non-federal territory. So we'll see how that goes. But it looks like at this point in time, the future of that installation on slavery at Independence Hall is it's going to be removed from the Park Service territory for sure.
Interesting. Is the administration just focused on slavery, on enslaved peoples, or is this going to spread? I mean, World War II, Japanese Americans were put in confinement, concentration centers, whatever you want to call them. They were not happy about that. There were probably some disparaging comments made about their confinement. Where does this stop?
That's a very good question. I don't know where it stops. Certainly, the opening salvos in this offensive on history have taken aim at sites that have to do with the African American experience, slavery in particular, that could spread to civil rights sites like Birmingham Civil Rights, the Selma to Montgomery Trail, Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley. But we are also seeing the potential for interpretation at Japanese American confinement or concentration sites. Anything that has to do with labor history and struggle, anything that has to do with women's history, women's suffrage, anything that people within this administration or within the Secretary of the Interior's current retinue, they feel that it denigrates America or Americans. And that's a pretty broad brush that they're painting with at this point in time. All of these things could be up for sanitization. We might even be looking at a history of the Second World War that stops before we get to the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that we just sort of, the war ends and we move on. It's the world since 1945. I don't know where they're headed, but I think once this sort of thing starts, it is potentially infinite and unbounded.
Now, obviously, it does result in a distorted view of American history. But if it does it only affect those park visitors who are aware of that history?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think I need to be careful just from a personal and professional perspective of investing so much energy and so much enthusiasm and so much love for our national parks and for American history. I guess there are people who will never visit Gettysburg and they will have long and happy and pleasant lives. There will be people who never visit the Grand Canyon who have long and pleasant lives. I think that parks play an important role in protecting and preserving our shared national narrative. And so it worries me that some of this history is being excised from national parks. But I think, the focus at this point in time in a lot of these places is on slavery. So let me share this with you. The reason why we're still fascinated with and focused on stuff that happened 250 years ago, 150 years ago, is because the lasting impacts and the legacy of slavery are with us still to this day. And one of the things that happened, if we go back in, the historic record, is that most of the European countries who were involved in the African slave trade could not manage to reconcile the abomination that was slavery with their religious and moral practices. They couldn't do it, but they also couldn't let go of the profits that were available to them, massive profits that were available to them from the slave trade. So how do you square that circle? You create a system of belief that suggests strongly that people of African descent are not entirely human, that we don't value education, that we don't love our families the same way that other people do, that we don't seek education, um, and that we've never made any positive, lasting contributions to the world, to the planet, to the country. And you roll out a philosophy like that for 5 years, 50 years, 250 years, and you get to a point where still in 2025, the residue of that leads us into discriminatory housing practice, discriminatory employment practices, and it also leads to things like 10 years ago, a young guy walking into Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdering 9 parishioners at a prayer service because he felt that those Black people were an imminent threat to him and his way of life. We are still dealing with this. And so, in my opinion, having the Scourged Back photograph, having the National Park Service talk about the history, the parts where, as Abraham Lincoln would have said, we did not live up to the better angels of our nature, is important because I think it provides us all with an opportunity to learn, to see each other, and then maybe to develop a little bit of healing and to be able to come together on that. So I think it isn't just that people are going to go to a park and not get the kind of interpretation in a month or so that they got 2 months ago, but we're going to be missing some stuff as a society and as a culture, and I think that's important. I think it's tragic.
How do you push back against it? How do you stop this type of hiding of history?
Well, it's a good question in terms of how we push back against this. I think one is just making sure that the public understands what's at stake. And we are still in a world where when people stop to think about the national parks, if they do, they're tending to think about these large landscape natural parks out in the West. And we need to help folks understand that even those large landscape Western parks are chock full of historic and cultural resources, tribal history, African American history, certainly Latino Hispanic history, Asian Pacific Islander American history, LGBTQ history, women's history, labor history, all of it. Um, and if you care about the story of this country being accurate, just, inclusive, and inspiring, then you want to support an agency that has, over the last 20 to 30 years, become really expert at helping to make that happen. And I think that's the first thing. So, at NPCA, as an advocacy organization, we're trying to help shape the public discourse on this. Because what we're hearing from the administration is every time a story comes out about the removal of a photograph or the altering or sanitation of a display, their response is to say it's just the one thing, or this is being exaggerated or overblown. No, we're not exaggerating. It's not being overblown. And we need to help people understand that the best way to push back against this is to take action. We still feel that congressional champions and allies are going to be important in this process. So we are going to continue to work with this Congress and the next Congress and the next Congress after that to make sure we're getting better budgets, better policies, and maybe looking to a way where ultimately we can stop this and maybe start to reverse this. But we also have to make sure that we are engaging people at the grassroots level. And I think one of the things that excites me about the 250th anniversary of American independence is the leading role that a lot of local and state agencies and organizations and individuals are playing. And they are determined to make sure that the stories that they are promoting are inclusive and accurate. And I think that's going to be one of the things that helps to save this keystone anniversary that we're approaching right now. But we've got to be able to push back on this. And I think, anybody who's feeling like, okay, the die is cast, there's no opportunity to affect change here. I can tell you, and I'm not looking to wave a flag of victory. I'm not saying that I'm responsible for this. I'm not saying that NPCA is responsible for this. But what we have seen over the last couple of months is that sometimes when these policies are rolled out, they're not being rolled out in a way that's transparent. I don't know that there's a great deal of thought behind them. And when the public says, whoa, this is not what we want, there's a bit of hesitation on the part of the people who are rolling these things out. So I think we can stop this, but it's going to take a commitment from people to make sure that they're doing grassroots advocacy and outreach. Go to your national park, hug a ranger, or I guess if we're still in a COVID era, a fist bump, elbow bump. Let the folks of the National Park Service understand how much you appreciate what they do. Let them understand that it's not their fault, that they are responding to instructions that are coming down from above, and then tell your elected representatives, your local and state representatives, that you like what you see at Gettysburg, you like what you see at Antietam, you like what you see at Chaco Canyon, and that you want to see more of that, not less of that. And I think that's the way that we effectively push back on a variety of levels. It's like the 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional chess.
I admire your optimism, Alan. The fact remains that for 15 years now, I think the College of Colorado has been doing public surveys of Western states and attitudes towards drilling and mining and conservation of land and clean air and clean water. And for 15 years, the majority of the people who were contacted were in support of conservation of land, of keeping monuments the same size, not shrinking them or getting rid of them, of clean air and clean water, of recreational pursuits. There's an organization called Mountain Pack that represents, I think, 300 communities across the West. And they wrote letters pushing against Senator Lee's effort to sell off federal lands, letters about the administration's desire to shrink national monuments. And it doesn't seem to be having any effect that we've seen so far. But I'm wondering, in the case of Harpers Ferry or Fort Pulaski, have we heard from state officials? Has the governor of West Virginia spoken up? Has the town council of Harpers Ferry spoken up?
Not that I'm aware of, no. And I think that's also a part of the work that we need to continue to do right now. I spoke about the grassroots need, but generating grassroots awareness is then the first step towards engaging local elected officials. So we've got to have a plan. We're putting a plan in place. NPCA is developing I mean, there's no shortage of coalitions these days, as you are well aware, but a sort of
Very few.
preservation heritage coalition that would be more focused on this. And I think we want to try to engage with organizations like the Organization of American States, American Historical Association, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, to get larger national organizations to help mobilize their members to then make exactly that kind of outreach so that we are reaching the state and local people who could help to push back against this if we convince them to do that and if they are so inclined. We need to make a bigger fuss about this because I think that I go back to this notion of whether national parks are America's best idea or not, and I've got some thoughts about that. But I think if they were, this kind of assault on history and preservation in our national parks would have generated already more resistance.
Mhm.
So we've got to make sure that we are communicating with all the folks that we can to get them aware of this, outraged about it, and then taking action in appropriate ways about this.
I know there's a group of concerned individuals up at the University of Minnesota, librarians, who on their own started this Save Our Signs campaign that has amassed by now more than 5,000 images from across the national park system of signs that they don't want to see disappear or signs that might disappear. Is NPCA taking any type of approach to going into parks where there are stories of the enslaved and trying to capture those interpretive placards before they disappear?
I personally have a folder of photographs from a couple of Civil War battlefields and civil rights sites that will be plugged into kind of a Save Our Signs sort of campaign. I think the Save Our Signs people are, you know what this reminds me of? I'm not sure if you're a fan of Kurt Vonnegut, but in Fahrenheit 451, the novel, it's like we are at this point in time, we're the folks who are wandering in the woods, exiled. And we have memorized poetry and literature and other things like that. And ultimately, the hope is that we can come out of the woods at some point in time and recapture these things in text. So the Save Our Signs campaign is critical. I would encourage anybody who is going to a national park, if you see something that's got a theme that looks like it might be or could possibly be considered by some folks to be disrespectful or denigrating of America or Americans, snap a photograph of it, send it to Save Our Signs. You can send it to me at aspears@npca.org. We're building a file. And, literally, I think we're looking forward to an opportunity, hopefully sooner rather than later, when we can begin to build back.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. What about Congress? The Republicans certainly seem to be in lockstep with the administration. What about the Democrats? Have they expressed any outrage?
I think that there has been plenty of opposition expressed. I know that there's a letter moving right now in the House. It's being circulated by Representative Don Beyer from Virginia, and it is asking for transparency in this whole process related to the Executive Order 3431. It expresses concerns about the removal of interpretive materials from the parks, and it wants the Secretary of the Interior or someone from the administration to provide specific information about what they are asking for, what's been removed, what's been taken down. So that is a letter that is circulating today. I think it's Friday the 19th, and I think it's open until next week. So we've got we've got people who are taking action. I think, as you are aware, being a Democrat in a Republican-controlled House of Representatives is you don't have a lot of power, but I do think that we've got some people who are attempting to push back on this assault on our historic and cultural resources. And we certainly support that kind of action. And we are helping at this point in time to drive co-sponsors and signers onto Mr. Byers' letter. And very grateful for his work on this.
Now, one of the interesting things about this executive order by the president and then the secretarial order by Mr. Burgum, it seems to they start the clock ticking in 2020 when Joe Biden became president. And I know Interior press people have told me, yeah, we're just looking back to 2020. Do you believe that's the case, or are they going to go beyond? Well, obviously they've already gone beyond 2020. If you're talking about the Scourged Back photo, which has been up there for quite a while.
It has been up for quite a while. I think 2020 is an interesting date that they've picked, and so obviously the start of President Biden's administration, but also that summer, that tragic summer, the murder of George Floyd. And I think that there are people who feel like what happened in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd the Black Lives Matter protest really becoming front and center, was a bridge too far for some of our more conservative friends. And I think that they are concerned about the overreaction, the overcorrection for history. And I think my response to that would be, you can look at 2020 if you want to, but my frame of reference on this goes back for 30 years when we didn't have an appreciation, an understanding, or agreement within the National Park Service or at our national parks that slavery was a root cause of the American Civil War. So by the summer of 2020, what some people see as this cultural revolution of wokeness coming from the left was actually just the continuance of an effort to make our history more inclusive. And I think that the Park Service, the job has not been thorough, the job has not been perfect, but they have been leading this work. And I am supportive of them leading this work. And right now, it seems like we are in a regressive era where some of those accomplishments are being turned back. So 2020 is an interesting date. And they are, I think, in the process, the administration, the Secretary of the Interior, certainly a lot of the things that were flagged by national parks were flagged as interpretive materials that have been around long before 2020. So you are correct in that regard. And we've got to keep an eye out for what's going to make that list.
Yeah, no, it's really going to be interesting. Sadly interesting. It also begs the question, is there any legal recourse to this?
So I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV or podcasts, but I think we are looking into that at this point in time. And I think where we would go with that is, let's say, we'll go back to Harpers Ferry for a moment. And the idea behind the establishment of Harpers Ferry, it's my favorite, national monument designation date. It was June 30th, 1944. So it's about 2.5 weeks after D-Day in the Second World War, and we're still doing the parks thing. That's how important protecting these historic and cultural resources and natural resources are to all of us. But if you go to Harpers Ferry, a part of that story is to talk about civil rights with the Niagara movement taking place there in 1905, but also Civil War stuff. Stonewall Jackson's greatest victory did not come at Chancellorsville in 1863. It came at the Antietam campaign, his investiture of Harper's Ferry on the way to meet up with Robert E. Lee on the fields of Antietam. But then prior to that, it's John Brown and abolition. John Brown went to Harper's Ferry to start a slave insurrection and to capture the weapons at the arsenal there and then arm African Americans and move into the South, terrorizing Southern slave owners as he went. Okay. If that is part of the founding vision of the park, then how can you go into the John Brown Museum and begin taking stuff down? That actually could be, and I can't guarantee this, not a lawyer, but that actually could be a violation of the park's founding charter. And you could see those again at Manzanar. If the purpose is to educate the public about Japanese incarceration and removal during the Second World War, and you want to take down signage or interpretations that talk about what it was like for Japanese Americans to be held against their will and to be mistreated in that way, that could also be a violation of the park's founding charter. So there could be legal cases to be made. I think we are going to try to investigate that. We are not doing so now, but maybe that's the next step or one of the next steps in this process.
That'd be really interesting. Of course, the courts seem to be affected by this administration as well. What other concerns do you have about what's going on?
Well, I think, from an advocacy perspective, I just want to go back to maybe where we started the conversation, which is that we've got sometimes we tend to silo things in the advocacy community. And I think that this is a perfect example of how we need to bust open those silos so that things are interconnected in terms of the advocacy and the threats that we think are facing national parks. We've got bad budgets coming out of the House, a better one coming out of the Senate for FY26. Hopefully they'll be able to do something in terms of a continuing resolution and avoiding a government shutdown. But we've got 24% drop in staffing level for the National Park Service just from the start of this year. And then we've got the history erasure issue. All three of those things are connected. When you've got bad budgets and not enough people, that is going to undermine the ability of the National Park Service to interpret our historic and cultural resources in ways that are accurate, just, inclusive, and inspiring. And so one of the things we're working on at NPCA and in my shop is making sure that we weave in these not so disparate elements into a campaign. And we're letting people know that if you don't support the removal of signage from a national park, then part of that resistance has to also be making sure that they've got enough staff and making sure that they've got enough money, making sure that the National Park Service has the resources that they need to fulfill their mission. So I think that's one of the things that we're working on at NPCA. And I'm hoping that there are other organizations, other advocacy groups that take that on as well, so that we see the full, wholesome perspective of what we need in terms of being park advocates to make a difference.
Yeah, I think they teach journalists to be cynical and skeptical from the outset, to always question things. And, could all those things be interrelated as part of the administration's plan to cut $1 billion from the National Park Service's budget to get rid of sites that they don't think are appropriate jewels of the national park system? And if they can disappear history, so to speak, there will be outside groups that say, well, we want to tell those stories. And the administration will say, fine, you pay for it.
No, I think that's a very, very grave concern. And you're kind of helping me to fill out the point that I was making. If the budgets continue to go in the wrong direction and the president has the ability to cut another, several million dollars from the National Park Service budget, we can get to a point where the agency can only maintain and protect probably the capital N, capital P national parks. And so that means that there could be, as much as 2/3 of the national park system that they either are allowed to atrophy, wither on the vine, or maybe they are given to the states or sold off to private interests. I spent a lot of time, Kurt, in the last several years working in Mississippi on the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument. So I've gotten to know Mississippi and the people in Mississippi a little bit. I think it's a wonderful state. It's got a bloody history related to race relations, but I think it's a great state with a lot of wonderful people in it. But let's say something happens with the civil rights sites that the Park Service has been able to establish in Mississippi over the last 6 or 7 years or so, including Medgar and Murray Evers out of Jackson. We still have a governor in Mississippi who wants to celebrate Confederate Heritage Month. So is that an elected representative who can be trusted to take on, at a state level, the responsibility for telling Mississippi's civil rights history? The answer to that could be a resounding yes. But what I do know is that it's the National Park Service that has the ability to take on the telling and the preservation and the interpretation of these really challenging stories, and they just excel at doing that. And so parceling that off to a private interest or a state interest is something that worries me, quite frankly.
Yeah. Are you worried that Black History Month is going to disappear from the national park system?
I'm not sure that it will. I think that why are you going to pick fights like that just make no sense? I mean, some of the stuff that's going on right now actually doesn't make much sense either. But I think that there are ways that you can honor commitments to broader things like Latino Heritage Month or Women's History Month or the African or Black History Month. And certainly if it gets taken away from the National Park Service, it's not going anywhere from a national perspective. And again, we've got organizations like the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and then my partners in the National Heritage Area System that are dedicated still to telling diverse stories and sharing that history. And so I don't think it's going to disappear completely, but I think we lose a lot if it disappears from the national park system. So we got to keep an eye on that and worry about that too.
That's Alan Spears. He's the Senior Director for Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association. Alan, I appreciate your time and your insights today. Please keep me in the loop with what NPCA is finding out about other parks where interpretive materials are disappearing. And on the legal front, it'll be interesting to see if anybody makes a test case concerning the enabling foundation documents of parks and what they're supposed to be interpreting.
Well, we'll stay talking about this. And Kurt, thank you for making time for me today. It's always a pleasure to get reconnected to you and have a conversation about stuff I love, like history and parks.
That's our show for this week. I hope you found it informative. Next week, Jan Childs is joined by staff from the Appalachian Trail Conservancy to discuss how repair work is going with sections of the Appalachian National Scenic Trail that were heavily impacted by Hurricane Helene a year ago. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.